Welcome back to yet another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Today, I am so excited to be speaking with Ebony Bridwell-Mitchell. She is the Herbert A. Simon Professor of Education, Management, and Organizational Behavior at Harvard, where she studies how organizational structures and institutional forces shape the success or failure of K-12 education reforms. Her work blends qualitative and quantitative methods, including social network analysis, to understand how real change happens in schools and why it often stalls. She has published widely across fields, earned support from major funders, and developed analytical tools used by policymakers and practitioners working to improve educational opportunities for underserved students. Rooted in values shaped by her family and early Montessori education, she brings a deep commitment to integrity, self-directed learning, and practical problem solving to her work as a scholar, teacher, and collaborator with educational organizations across the country. How are you doing today?
I am well. That was a lovely introduction. I always find myself worrying that people will read all of the things, which I get increasingly uncomfortable about because it's strange to hear someone say nice things about you, which it shouldn't be, but it sometimes is. So thank you.
Imagine if every time somebody met another person, you just kind of like have this dramatic introduction of who you are, and that, I mean, that would be, I mean, it just, I think the thing that I find really funny about bios is that you have like everyone has like a self narrative that kind of makes helps them make sense of who they are,
Sure.
and then you never really have to see how other people kind of perceive you. But then when you read a bio, that's one of the few times you have to actually confront, oh my God, this is the identity that other people are perceiving me as. Otherwise, you just have to kind of, you know, put your kind of interpretation onto people, which feels a little bit more less jarring, right?
Yeah, I totally agree. It reminds me of how often in music concerts when I grew up, there would be the person who was going to be the main star and then the person they called the hype man, whose job it was to just kind of help the crowd remember how good the person coming on was going to be. And so I always have these strange moments like that where I'm like, oh, you kind of get your personal hype man when someone is reading your bio. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you taking that role, even briefly. So
Yeah.
thanks.
I mean, I am so excited for today's conversation. We've spoken a couple times before this, and I feel like I think one of my favorite things about this podcast is just every time I talk to somebody new, I get a whole nother perspective on how to look at education. And I think each perspective gives a new light and also new understanding into this kind of world of education and also more broadly, just life in general. And so I'm really excited to get into your particular perspective today. But I'm first really curious, what was the origin story behind how you became fascinated by organizations and their impact on how policy is just implemented?
Mhm. Well, it's a pretty straight kind of explanation, but maybe straightforward because retrospectively you make sense of things for yourself in a way that doesn't quite happen as you're going through it. But I certainly do remember the moment when I decided I would study education, not just policy, but also organizations. And it was after having gotten a degree in education policy, but then going to work in a public school in East New York, Brooklyn. Entering the school feeling like I had been equipped with all the things that I needed to know with my fancy public policy degree, but then coming to recognize that everything that I had learned, or at least so much of what I had learned, didn't seem to be explaining the things that were the most salient pressures and kind of factors that were shaping the way I was experiencing my work, the way students were experiencing kind of their time in school. And I didn't quite have the answer to what it was, meaning I knew I didn't have the answer. So, I had been taught in a lot of different schools. So I did research, I went to bookstores. In fact, the first year I started teaching was the first year that Google was in existence. So nobody went on and Googled the answer to anything. You went to the library, you read magazines. And I ended up finding a book in the downtown library. The downtown, actually, it was the Barnes and Nobles in Brooklyn. And it was called Management Tasks and Responsibilities. And there was this little line in there that was about how public service institutions may not need management less than for-profit businesses, but may need it more. At the time, I didn't know the person who wrote the book was a famous management guru, basically. The person was Peter Drucker. But just that little sentence helped me realize, oh, there's an entire world of people who are kind of thinking about the kinds of things that seem to be influencing my experience. And that's how I learned that management and organizations was probably where the answers to my questions lay.
I mean, it's so fascinating to me because when you take any problem into consideration, it's really hard to know where the bottleneck is, what's actually happening, and where is maybe the implementation of an idea separate from maybe the ideals of whatever idea it is. And tracing it down the system is so complicated. Let's say, even if you were to come up with let's just say hypothetically, you were able to come up with the most phenomenal idea for education possible, how that actually gets implemented down the system, who ends up doing it, how is it taken advantage of or not taken advantage of, who ends
Mhm.
up feeling like they have access to it or is kind of pushed
Mhm.
away from it. I mean, there's so many things that can happen throughout that process, which actually might move it completely far from the original idea itself, which is
Sure.
why the structures of these institutions matter so much. And so, then I'm just curious, as in your experiences as your teacher in Brooklyn, what were kind of the things that in your day to day made that evidently clear?
So one, I have two examples I can give you, but I remember it was actually before school even started, and I was feeling very excited about teaching these sixth graders, and I had purchased this, it's hard to explain, like 3D poster that would decorate the door of my classroom. And I remember like I had this impression of like the doorway to learning, and I was very excited about it, and it kind of had all these pieces that stuck out. And I remember some colleagues coming in and walking past the door, and like you could just kind of see some of them would roll their eyes. Some of them would say directly, like, I don't know why you're bothering doing that. The kids are just going to rip it down. And I kind of I paid attention. So I put extra tape on all of the things. But the kids kind of came in, they loved it, they didn't take it down, like it worked out perfectly. But that was the first time that I realized, oh, people who are in this social context, I didn't refer to it then, but who are in this as a social context, but people who are here have a very different way of understanding the students, what's possible of them, what I should and should not be doing. And that was kind of my first clue because in my mind, of course, it made perfect sense to do all the things you think would be the most important things for your students. And that's clearly what I thought I was doing, but it was very clear that other people in the context thought about it very differently. And I didn't quite understand. My policy degree did not explain why that would be happening. And then the second thing that I remember, this was also at the beginning of the standards movement. And so maybe my first year teaching was maybe probably the New York State standards had been around for 4 or 5 years. And, this is a policy directive from the state trying to get students to kind of learn according to very concrete standards. And we had like all the English language arts standards, mathematics standards, and they had these numbers on them that were like E2C, like English language arts standard 2, part C. And that seems like a great idea. But the thing that I noticed that many of the people who worked in the school seemed to pay the most attention to was not whether or not during my teaching I was actually doing the things in the standard, but they were very intent on making sure that I had put all around my classroom wall these goldenrod colored sheets of paper with the standard numbers E2C. So no one seemed to care that much what I was teaching, but they cared a lot whether or not you could see the standards around the room. And I thought, well, this also doesn't seem to be explained very well by my public policy degree. And so those are two examples, this recognition of, in the second example, this disconnect, or what people in my field might call decoupling between the kind of formal structures, the existence of these standards, from what's supposed to be happening on a day-to-day basis, like the actual things that you're teaching. And then in the first example, the difference between like the how people's perception of a social context and who they're connected to in it, what their social identity is, makes a big difference for how not only they're experiencing that context, but the expectations they have of themselves and for others.
Wow. This seems to be the biggest kind of tension that I feel between educators who are actually on the ground versus policymakers who sometimes have never been in a classroom or have never been at a school, including me. I feel like I've taught in different capacities, but I've never actually spent multiple years in a classroom to figure out what the problems actually are. And so when you think about education, it's really funny because I sometimes meet people who are now in their 40s, 50s, who still talk about education as if it was the way that when they were in school, which,
Mhm,
now it's
mhm,
been a few decades. And so
mhm,
this tension always kind of exists. So I'm curious, in your experience being in policy school, what do you think are maybe some of the ways in which you can merge that gap? So it's
mhm,
not like two different worlds kind of talking different
mhm.
languages to each other.
It's a really great question because it was the recognition of that gap while I was in policy school that, in fact, made me go to teach. So I was at the Kennedy School of Government for 2 years, but like, probably within the first few months, like, it's Harvard, you have all these amazing people come in, they know a lot, but you could always tell somehow there was this quality between the people who seemed to really understand how education worked on the ground in context, and we're talking about policies in this nuanced way that you couldn't quite put your finger on, but seemed to be describing like a set of mechanisms, like you could see them talking about like a links in a causal chain in a way other people were kind of talking in these very smart ways, but you couldn't quite put your finger on where the there was. And my recognition and experience of that is what made me want to go to teach. I didn't want to go into policy being the kind of policy person who didn't quite seem like they knew what they were talking about in terms of what actually mattered most, in my opinion, which was, how do we help schools, students, teachers, families, school leaders, do better in their work on the ground. And I think the main reason that doesn't happen, meaning in policy schools, is that this actually relates to my own, field of study and something we were talking about just a moment ago in terms of the social context that we all operate in and how we see ourselves, our own social identity, who we think our peers are. And people are operating in these groups where they are rewarded, I mean, socially rewarded, told they're smart, influential, high status, have legitimacy. All of these rewards come from a group of people who are very much like them. So you don't necessarily even come to realize that you don't know all of the things, that you don't have the insight that you do because you're in a social group that's thinking very much like you. And so until we are willing to create context, and by context, I mean like situations where a meeting or situations where a conference or situations where we're doing work in our schools and there's people from lots of different roles, not only present, but given equal access to kind of the airtime, equal access to the legitimacy that it takes to be heard and listened to. I think oftentimes people in groups have different ideas, but there's a well understood, if not spoken out loud, rule around who are the people to pay the most attention to. And people with different
Mm.
ideas don't necessarily get heard, even if they are there in the room.
I mean, there's so much I think in what you just shared there. I mean, I've talked a lot about on this show. I went to a few conferences over the years in Italy and Switzerland, and my mind exploded in those experiences because for the first time there was like a level playing field, no matter how old you were, no matter how expert you were in your field, where there was a space where everyone truly learned from each other. And there was every year they would have a different theme. And it was so different from a lot of the conferences that I'd attended in the US, where there's kind of like a panel of speakers and you know who to go to, who to listen to, and based on their credentials and professionals, they kind of just talk to everyone else. It's the same way how schools work. You have a teacher
Mhm,
who's credentialed and they kind of just are the main teacher and everyone else just listens because what could they
mhm,
possibly offer? And
mhm,
I feel like a lot of what you're sharing is, I mean, this is where I sometimes have the complexity. I'm curious how you kind of navigate this because from the side of policy people, you sometimes are at such a high level that you don't actually get to know the realities on the ground. But I think
Mhm.
when you're on the ground, you end up getting so bogged down by the struggles and challenges of your day to day that it becomes really
Sure.
hard to dream free of the limitations that you are currently exposed to, which
Yeah.
policy people can do very well. So you kind of have this tension where it's like you're either too locked in on the day to day that you can't, it's really hard to dream big and way larger, or you're dreaming too big that you don't know how to connect that. So, as a teacher, how would you say maybe to keep that fire of like things can be better, things can be very different than what they are right now,
Mhm.
and to keep that kind of, ability to dream?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say is wanting to emphasize the importance of how the ability to do that as a teacher might lie partly with the individual teacher themselves. Like I might be able to say things that would help any individual teacher, but ultimately, I think the important thing is how do organizations create conditions or space where it's possible for teachers to do that. So, for example, if it's the case that you're constantly under pressure, if it's the case that there's always a need to kind of put out fires, if it's the case that you don't have the resources that you need, so you're constantly scrambling, when there's not the space to be able to think more broadly, to dream bigger, no matter what things I might say, like, here are the things a teacher could do. Those things won't be actionable because you're operating in a certain set of conditions that make it not possible.
Hmm. Well, I guess in your experiences working with organizations, and when we're saying organizations, are we talking about the environment in which a school exists? So that includes the city, it includes the board members, it includes school. Is that when we say an organization?
So when I say organization, I think that's a great question because I always am having this image in my mind of those like Russian more, I think they're called Mortroshka dolls. They're like nested dolls. And there's a tiny one in the middle that gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think about organizations in that way. So like if you're thinking about a school context, like maybe the tiniest doll, the smallest unit of the organization is like what happens in any individual classroom. And then up from that is what happens in the set of classrooms at the school. And then up from that is what happens across the different schools in a district. And then up from that, I could kind of keep going all the way up until we might be talking about what goes on at the state level in terms of state departments of education. And the reason that's important is because I think in every single one of those organizational contexts, in each of the nested dolls, you have to do this same thing. How is a teacher creating conditions in their classroom that lets a student ask questions, think big, explore things? How is a principal and the leadership team creating conditions that help the teachers in the school think differently, ask questions? And you could keep doing that up each level of those nested parts of an organization.
Hmm. I was just gonna add, it's there sounds like a down, down, down
Oh, you know
sound
what?
going
You
on.
are right. That is an alarm that I set in the background to remember to do something. Let me just tell my Google Nest to be quiet. I was hoping that Zoom would be smart enough to get rid of it, but give me 1 second.
Yeah.
All righty.
Nice. That's a very peaceful sound though. Um, no, I mean, okay, so I really appreciate how you kind of laid that out. And so, okay, let's say without actually thinking about the policy itself, let's say we created policy X, which is actually perfect. For some end goal outcome X, it actually does phenomenally. But for some reason, it's not actually turning out to be that way. When understanding, it's so easy, I think, often to just be like, ah, it's the teacher's fault. Or, okay, the teacher's not working, let's blame it on the principal. Oh, the principal's not working, it's easy to just point the blame at somebody. But when you take it more of an organizational perspective, you can actually identify so many different places where a problem may be existing because you're now looking at something so much more larger and complex. And so, in doing that, where do you start with identifying where the problem can be?
Mhm. I would argue that, just as you said, the problem is often at multiple places across those different levels. And then one question you might ask yourself is like, what lever do I pull that gets the biggest bang for the buck in terms
Hmm.
of like addressing whatever I think is the biggest challenge? And I think it's really difficult to see what the answer might be from a policy context. I think the job of policy is to try and put in place a framework for how things should work. But how that framework actually plays out in any given context, meaning at any one of those lower levels, is going to be very different. And we got very obsessed at one point talking about, quote, fidelity of implementation. So, this idea that there's this policy that we might come up with that works and works perfectly. But most often, even when there is research demonstrating that something works, that research that's demonstrating that something works is doing two things. One, it's often data collected from kind of very particular context, even if it's experimental data, kind of the conditions and the data that is available to kind of run an experiment like that or create one is based on certain kinds of data. And then second, even when that data finds some effect that we feel like there's a causal relationship, when you actually look at kind of the statistical results, there's always an indication of variation. No treatment, no policy, no thing that you think that works ever is explaining 100% of the variation in an outcome. And when that's true, it means there's lots of other factors that are going on and contributing to the outcome. And it's almost impossible to predict in advance all the many different factors that might be playing into the outcome and then explaining why it actually works. But down on the ground, all those trees that we were talking about a moment ago when you were like, it's really hard to dream big. I think about that as like the forest for the trees problem. Down on the ground, all those trees that people are kind of where that obscures their vision, those are the exact same things that are helping to explain the variation. So as long as we stay obsessed with people must implement the policy with fidelity, and we don't have more confidence in people on the ground whose everyday experiences is with the trees, and they can say, oh, you know what, this is actually how things operate in my particular context. And because of that, while the policy might have said do A, B, and C, what will actually work in my context is A, B, and C prime. But from the perspective of policymakers, oftentimes if you're not doing exactly A, exactly B, exactly C, then you haven't done the
Mm.
policy correctly. And so the question that you ask is like, where does the problem lie? The problem might actually lie with not allowing for enough variation and exploration with how a policy is implemented so it could actually work across different contexts and not in the one place or with the certain kinds of people that you were able to demonstrate effects for in your actual research.
I have
That
so
was a
many
very long-winded
questions.
question
No, no,
answer. I hope it was helpful.
I have so many questions for you. I have so many questions for you because I mean, this is so fascinating. Because okay, so in theory, if you were to really look in the nitty-gritty, they're infinitely I always forgot to say this. Basically, there's infinite number of contexts. If you look at actually the t exact details, there are no two contexts that are exactly the same.
Mhm,
But
mhm,
when trying to make a wide-ranging policy implementation, you have to generalize to some extent. So you lose some of that specificity just because
mhm,
you can't
mhm,
give a different policy to every school or organization, for
mhm,
example.
mhm,
So in doing that, you have to find the best kind of point where you're able to have enough variation without losing too much of the specificity, but also
Mhm.
being able to generalize a little bit. So,
Mhm.
in that sense, do you feel like right now we are accounting for too few contexts, or do you feel like we're on that side where we're accounting for too many contexts?
I don't think it's so much about accounting for too few or too many. So what you're describing, the way I would think about what you're describing is like just that sweet spot is what we try to do is to find the average effect. That's how most kind of statistical prediction works. What's the average effect? But you often hear people say, and it's true that like there is no average school. And so it's not so much that we're not accounting for enough or not accounting for too little. It's that we're setting in the right way, meaning I think it is smart to try and find the average effect in terms of what might explain or do the most for, the largest group of people or situations. But because there are very few contexts that are exactly like the average that you found, until you're willing to, by your, I mean, policymakers at each level are willing to say and recognize there's actually very few places that are exactly like the average effect. The only way we're probably going to get this to work is say, here's what we think is most likely. That's what an average is. What's most likely to work? But then there's lots of variation around that. And if this is most likely to work in your context, giving people in those contexts the opportunity and having faith in them to say, here are the things that need to be adjusted in our context because it's not
Mm,
exactly like the average. I do think
mm,
we have to start with what's most likely, but then recognize that what's most likely doesn't necessarily apply even to the great majority of people. Like thinking about the difference between like means and medians, just because something's an average doesn't so just to press the point, like when we talk about average income in the United States, just because you get a number that's in the middle, that isn't necessarily the number that most people actually are have as their income. It's a combination of the extremes. And it's a similar thing when we're talking about what do we think might be a policy that works on average. It may not even work for the most places, but we do know that it accounts for the most variation. And so I think this kind of goes back to what we were talking about a moment ago, in terms of like the how even when you can have people who might have different points of view in a context, they may not be empowered to speak, they may not kind of be listened to in the same way. I think there is how do I want to say this? I think there's a little bit of anxiety about what it would mean to give people on the ground more full autonomy and agency to interpret and implement policies in the ways that make sense for their context, because there certainly is some risk that they will, in the context, not implement any policy or at all, or say, you know what, the problem here, is my kids. The problem here is this community. The problem here is this principle. And no matter what policy we might have, it doesn't make a difference. There certainly is some risk of that. And I think people worry about that risk a lot. And I think there is some reasons why people worry about that risk. But I think unless we're willing to be more risk taking about empowering people in school contexts to know enough about their work, know enough about their students, know enough about their context, I think we're going to have a hard time getting what we think we want. And I'll stop there.
I mean, no, I mean, I think I'm reading this book right now by Jeanette Wells called The
Mm,
Glass Castle. I
mm,
don't know. Yeah, I mean, phenomenal book for the main reason that it gives a perspective of American poverty that I feel like not many stories that I've read or is a memoir, I think really capture how different students are. I mean, each
mm,
child in the country is so vastly different that the perspective that you have of what children are like will be so influenced by the type of childhood that you had that it's so
mm,
hard to even imagine how variant that is without actually
mm,
putting yourself out of your comfort zone to go
mm,
learn about the experiences of others. And I
Mhm.
think what I'm hearing you say in a lot of just like this kind of divide throughout the levels is
Mhm.
that in some ways, I feel like the only way you can get that perspective
Mhm.
is by like actively kind of switching between those instead of it
Mhm.
having to be like a hierarchy that only moves
Mhm.
upwards, which is kind of just
Mhm.
like I think a bad way of looking at it because it's
Mhm.
like it's not like a principal is higher than a teacher because
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
can't be an effective principal without being a teacher. And I don't think you can be
Mhm.
an effective teacher without understanding the challenges of being a principal
Mhm.
either. And so
Mhm.
I feel like there's this Netflix movie called The Platform, which is a
I know
terrible,
it.
yeah, but just it's a terrible example for this. But it's the idea where these people, there's a social hierarchy that's built, and these people are just kind of switched at random to,
Mhm.
and experience the kind of wide variance of
Mhm.
what your experience is like, what you do. And I'm wondering if there could be something like that here, where I mean, it's obvious you can't, you obviously you can't do the same thing because there's
Mhm.
different skills needed in things. But
Mhm.
to some extent, I feel like every teacher would benefit a lot from having experienced what the challenges are from a policy perspective, and
Mhm.
policymakers would benefit a lot from being in a classroom. And so, being
Mhm.
intentional about having this kind of flow through the
Mhm.
different positions that you take might
Mhm.
give you that perspective that's needed to
Mhm.
maybe
Mhm.
think about change in a little bit more of an organizational manner, right?
I mean, I certainly think that is what was true of my own experience. I had a policy lens. Going to work in a school gave me a very different lens. Coming out of a school to then learn more about how organizations work is what came to help me understand that what I was interested in was not simply organizational change, but actually institutional change and like learning what the facets are of that. So I certainly think my own experience supports the idea that if you can put yourself in different places, you have more insight. And in fact, also kind of from my area of study, there's a kind of term people use, they talk about institutional entrepreneurship, kind of these individuals or groups that are able to see and do things in a way that hadn't been seen or thought of before and can actually take action to bring those new ways of thinking and doing into being. And oftentimes, one feature of those institutional entrepreneurs is that they actually have come from different contexts and imported ideas from different contexts into a new context. So they're able to put ideas and ways of doing things together in a way that no one in the new context would have thought about, but that seems very natural to those people because they had been in different kind of contexts. In fact, there's a paper by a sociologist. This is an older paper. His name is Ron Burt. He studies social networks, an area of research that I like to draw on often. And the name of this paper is Where Good Ideas Come From. And it's
Mm,
basically an empirical demonstration of this point that we're just making. Like when you think about sets of individuals who might be interacting and how they're connected, it's often the people who are connected to the most different other people who are the ones that are coming up with these we talk about divergent innovations with these ideas people wouldn't have thought of before. But that's because they have exposure to so many other different kinds of people and can integrate those experiences in a way that comes up with what appears to be a new idea, but is often either an idea imported from somewhere else or integrated from across a number of different somewhere else's.
mm. This is so fascinating because I often think about this in terms of just education reform in general, where it sometimes seems no matter what solution is presented, you will always run into these issues where I guess what I'm really getting at then is how do you think what about the process of reform can we then do better that we're not doing right now?
It's a hard question, so I'm taking my time because I want it to be both practical, my answer, but also generalizable. And we just described how those two things are often in tension. And if I were going to say what is one thing that we can do differently with reform? I want to answer thinking about those different levels of the organization that we talked about. There's one thing that I think we can do differently. It is to, in each one of those contexts, create an expectation that we should be asking questions about how we've conventionally done things, and we should be asking questions about what's being asked of us in a particular implementation context, and will that work here? What adjustments need to be made? And one of the reasons that I say this about the importance of setting this norm is because in some past research that I've done, I kind of wanted to ask myself the question, following up on some prior research, like what is it that might actually get people to approach their work in ways that's different than they had been approaching it, for a very long time. And so this was an experimental research study, basically brought different educators into a laboratory setting, asked them to teach a set of instructional practices on which they had been trained in a way that's very similar to what they would have remembered having, how they would have remembered having learned things when they were a kid or when their teacher would have taught them. And then had them kind of meet together in groups that were different in some ways, and then asked them to teach the lesson again. And the groups where people were more likely to do things differently, not teach things the exact same way that they had always been teaching them or that they thought was the widely accepted way to teach them. The groups that were most likely to have individuals do things differently were one, groups where there was an expectation. They had created a norm that it was okay to challenge each other in the group, to challenge what they had been trained to do for the study. But two other things were also important. One, everybody in the group also had to have a sense of certainty, like they knew what they were being asked to do. Like, oh, here is the task that that we as a group are supposed to be accomplishing. And they had to have a certain level of confidence in the expertise of other people in the group. So the combination of those three things, one, making sure that there was an expectation that we should challenge what we've been doing, that we should have confidence in the expertise of the other people around us, and that we are clear on what we're being asked to do. Those were the contexts in which people did things differently. And I think there's a lot about how organizations work where those three things don't happen that regularly. We're not encouraged to challenge the way things have always been done or what's expected of us. We don't always know the expertise of the other people we're working with or have confidence in them. And half of the time, we're not even 100% sure what is it we're trying to accomplish here, because we rely on certain routines, both social and practical, to get things done. And so I think that is the biggest thing that we could do, create these contexts at each organizational level we've talked about, where those three things are the natural way of doing work.
I can't tell you how much I love just bullet points and just like numbers of a one, two, three, because it just like makes something. I mean, on talking about clarity, it makes something so clear. So if we can break each one of these downs, I mean, the first thing I heard you say is the expectation and the allowance to challenge the status quo. And
Mm-hmm.
what is the difference between spaces in which that is allowed? And because I mean, even in saying the word allowed, right? I mean, I know that I don't remember the philosopher who talked about, but the type of two forms of freedom where
Mm-hmm.
even if there is a structure where the higher ups are allowing you to question, there's still
Mm-hmm.
this feeling of like, oh, thank you for allowing me, where that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily seem like that's just embedded in I still have to kind
Mm-hmm.
of, I'm dependent on you whether you allow me to or
Mm-hmm.
not, which is slightly
Mm-hmm.
different than where the quote unquote higher ups don't even have that image of like, I am somebody who's like, higher than you or I'm someone who's
Mm-hmm.
better than you. And I feel like then you don't need to necessarily be thankful. It's just the expectation or it's just kind of um it's a there's no one needs to give you permission to question. So
Mm-hmm.
in
Mm-hmm.
that sense, when you talk about the expectation, what are some of the things that organizations in which that's more common, what do they do?
Hmm. Well, there is a very well-known, what could I describe it as? I guess it's a case study, but a story people tell anecdotally all the time about this organization called IDEO, which is basically a design firm. And they're hired by people in lots of different industries because what they specialize in is not like um, they don't specialize in making any particular thing. They're not like experts in how do you make toothpaste or cars or even education. They're experts in how do you come up with something that would make it possible to do something that hadn't been done before. And one of the things that people talk about when they're talking about IDEO is one, a certain kind of egalitarianism. So this is something that you were just mentioning a moment ago, in terms of like not necessarily being worrying about the hierarchy, but also not censoring any idea too soon, meaning like letting everything get out there on the table before you start taking things off. But also these contexts where what people are actually rewarded for is the good idea, is the approach that like might not necessarily be what everybody would expect, but happens to work, where risk taking is like a good idea. And we're failing because if you tried lots of different things, the odds are just by the number of things that you try, some of those things aren't gonna work. And I think in a lot of our organizations, I'm not saying anything that people hadn't known before, but like the idea of it being okay to fail, the idea of taking risks, the idea of all of us having something to contribute, isn't something that happens as easily. And I think a lot of times we tell ourselves that the reason this has something to do with like people's concerns about their ego or status or privilege in the organization. And I do think there's some of that, like maybe the folks at the top really want and need to be at the top for their own egos. I'm sure, is some of that, but I actually think it has as much to do about the way we think our organizations have to work, meaning this kind of command and control structure. A person with a certain amount of knowledge who gets everybody else to do certain things is very efficient. It does make it easier to get things done. Like think about the military the command and control structure. Like if you are trying to execute on something, we don't have time for a lot of deliberative processes where people are taking risks. There's something in front of us. We've got to get it done. And it's very efficient. And a lot of how our organizations run, actually, in fact, a lot of research in the 1970s on organizations was funded by the Department of Defense. We can talk about that another time. But if that is your model for how an organization works, what the most important thing is for us to execute. Then it doesn't leave a lot of space for these other things. And so in the kind of organizations that we have, certainly in the United States, and that I think are a model for lots of other organizations, and in the kind of economy that depends on the organizations that we have, getting things done efficiently. Um, and by efficient, I mean getting the most for the least amount of cost. And I mean those all kinds of costs, not just like money, but social costs, time costs, energy costs, opportunity costs. That's the way most of our organizations are constructed. So I think it's easy to say, oh, the people at the top just want to be in charge and not listen to anybody. But they're partly operating in these ways because they are also in a context where they know things have to be executed. And if you want to execute things efficiently, not necessarily effectively, efficient doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to get something done. It means it's the best way to get something done for the cost that you're willing to put in. And I think that's often what is happening in our organizations and why we don't loosen ourselves up a little bit to these other ways of organizing our work. That was also very long-winded, Gautam.
No, I mean, no, no. I feel like every time you give an answer, I'm just like writing down so many notes because there's so many things that are coming up. Because I wonder, do you think a perfect organization exists, not in practice, but in
Mhm.
theory? Like in theory, if you were to design a perfect organization that accounts for everything that, is it possible
I
to
think it
exist?
depends on the answer. Perfect for what purpose? So
Yeah.
oftentimes people ask me, like, what is an organization? And organizations are basically just like social and technical aggregates, groups of people and things put together in service of some particular goal. And
Yes.
that goal usually has to be approved by the people who are within the organization, less so, but still, because you need them to work, and approved by people external to the organization, because that's where the resources come from to actually get the work in the organizations done. So I think if
Yes.
you're very clear on what the purpose is, you can certainly design a perfect organization to achieve that purpose. But
Yeah.
oftentimes we have multiple purposes in an organization. We want to produce the widget. We want to make people feel like they have meaning in their work. We want to have high status and be recognized as individuals and an organization. And I'm not sure if it's possible or how possible it is to create the perfect organization across many different
Mm,
purposes, especially if you're not clear about what those many purposes are, or if you're saying the purpose is A, but really the purpose is also B, C, and D. And then you're wondering, why aren't we accomplishing A? Because the organization is actually also operating to try and accomplish B, C, and D.
which is probably falls under the clarity set piece of that. And I think maybe that is an example where like I'm feeling like something like the military has a much clearer purpose than something as broad as maybe education. And
Mhm,
I might be saying that because I don't know the world of the military that well, and maybe
mhm,
they would people in that world would disagree.
mhm,
But to me, it feels like education is so complex, exactly for the reason that you're saying. And I
mhm,
really like this distinction where if you're able to have a singular purpose, I feel like even private organizations have much
mhm,
more clear focus of we need to make more money this quarter than
mhm,
last quarter,
mhm,
which is
mhm,
how you do it is different, but
mhm,
that is seems to be the single-minded goal
mhm,
in that
mhm,
entire thing. Where
mhm,
schools are so much more complex. I mean, some people
mhm,
might believe it's so that every student in their classroom can go get a
mhm,
job. Some people might believe it might be to lead a good life, but then what is a good life? And then some people
mhm,
might believe it so that they can go become good citizens and vote
mhm,
properly. And what
mhm,
does that mean? So it is so much more complex. And so in talking, this is something in my experience of policy and also in other worlds of education that I've been fascinated by is how little that conversation of
mhm,
purpose is actually discussed. Where I've
mhm,
spoken to so many educators that have shared that their schools have never once sat down and really talked about
mhm,
why are
mhm,
we educating at all? What is the
mhm,
point of this?
mhm,
And so they're not
mhm,
really on the shared page
mhm,
on the most fundamental question of
mhm,
everything
mhm,
that they're doing. So
mhm,
when talking about getting on the same page of a purpose for an organization,
mhm,
how do conversations around that take place?
mhm.
Because
Yeah.
that now you're drawing from different people's religious beliefs, you're drawing from all types of things where I'm not sure people will be able to agree on a purpose of
Mhm,
education.
mhm, mhm,
So how do you
mhm.
then get aligned on that?
Yeah, I'm smiling because it's reminding me of this book by her last name, I think, is Achenstein. Her first name could be Deborah or Barbara, but it's called The Micro Politics of the School. And one of the reasons that I like this book is because it's a good example of one of the key ideas that came out of a review of literature that I and a co-author did on how institutional processes operate in school contexts. And one of the things that came out from this book, basically, there were lots of different teacher communities. And in any community, people will agree and disagree, have different interests, have different identities. And when you looked at places where people were willing to recognize the existence of alternative approach, like alternative ways of thinking about things, integrate them to a certain extent, and agree to move forward with that integration. Those were the kinds of communities where people were able to, both the teachers in them kind of felt like, oh, we can get things done here, but also where they were actually able to get things done here. And so, one of the things that I think I'm trying to say about the answer to your question is it's true, we're not all going to think the same thing. But if we spend all of our time fighting about trying to hold ground on our one thing, trying to convince other people that only our thing and not their thing could be correct. All of that energy, which is what we usually do, quite frankly, is energy that's not very well spent because it's the context in which we're able to say, you know what, I hear you saying it's about citizenship. I hear you saying it's about workforce development. I hear you saying it's about the fulfillment of human potential. I hear you saying it's about full participation in a democratic society. No one of those things has to be right. How would we operate so that, some part of each one of those things were possible? It reminds me also, there's a famous philosopher, his name is John Rawls, where he has this experiment where he calls the veil of ignorance. And it's basically this philosophical experiment where you have to make a decision, but you have to make a decision not knowing what your personal identity is. So, like, you engage in this conversation, you actually know all the different positions that there are, but you actually don't know which position that you hold. And when he runs this experiment, it turns out people reach much more ethical decisions, not knowing what their own position is, but knowing what all the positions are, because they come up with a decision that will maximize the chances that their position, not knowing what it is, might be equally honored because they can't know in advance what their position is. And I think it's a very similar thing in organizational context. Like, how can we actually create the kinds of places where we can do what we're talking about, where we can have people actually be open to, one, recognizing there are different ways of thinking, be open to that and integrate them to some extent. I think it requires a certain willingness to like recognize that my thing doesn't have to be and can't possibly be the only thing. And I shouldn't put all my energy into trying to convince you that it is.
You're amazing. I mean, there is so much. I feel like I'm okay. So would you say then that the attempts to maybe try to somehow figure out what the perfect purpose is for schooling is kind of actually
That's
a
wasted
vain
energy.
attempt? Yeah, it's waste.
Yes.
So
The
more
purpose
in,
of schooling is all those things. And each person and each family needs something a little bit different. And it's partly why I think the school choice movement takes hold as strongly as it does. I personally am not a person who's against school choice. I am someone who thinks school choice without public oversight is a bad idea, for a number of reasons. But I do recognize that if there's so much variation in what people need, having different options and choices for them to choose from is important. But I think of yourself as a person. Like, what do you want out of school? You want to be able to get a job. You want to be fully fulfilled as a human being. You want to participate in the society in the best way that you can. Like, you want all of the things that education is for, even in a single person. So why would it be the one thing? Because people in groups have particular interests that they feel like they need to advance that one thing.
Hmm. So then, from a school's perspective, I think maybe the first thing is present, like you said earlier, presenting that these are all the different perspectives that people have, and then maybe equally respecting each perspective and sharing views and people who strongly believe in that. And which I then guess gets you to a point where you're able to appreciate each one of those purposes without having to place like one over the other. And then coming to a place, I guess, where, because the example that you gave with Rawls is really interesting, but I'm assuming maybe the grouping that was presented in that exercise was something that people didn't already have like a viewpoint over. But in this case, before you even get to the school, or you already have a really specific viewpoint on what schooling is for. So then how do
Mhm.
you kind of take on that open perspective when you
Mhm.
hear this
Mhm.
conversation?
Mhm. That reminds me of the question or what we were talking about before when you were talking about how we talk about leaders allowing certain things to happen. I do think you have to be intentional about creating a context where you are inviting those different perspectives and expecting that those different perspectives will be listened to and integrated. Going back to the results of the experimental study I did that we were talking about before, the expectation that we should challenge not only the way things have always been done, but challenge what we took for granted as true. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be. And it's not something we have a lot of practice with. And I would argue it might be even more difficult for the generations that are younger than me, where you don't find yourself as often in as many places with people who think very differently from you, because it's much easier to socially select into a group of very similarly thinking people if so many of your interactions are in a kind of online context. And so I think we never were great at it, but I think we've probably gotten worse at it, unfortunately. And until we can figure out how to do that, I think it's going to be really hard, but I do think that's what's necessary. And I will just say, just to drive the point home, the conversation that we're talking about is not an efficient way to run an organization. You made the point that like nobody in schools is talking about the purpose. People in schools don't think they have the time for that. Their job is to execute on the outcomes for student learning. And so we have to be willing to make certain trade-offs for what do we want in the long run versus what do we think we have to do in the short run.
Hmm. And having, I guess, space when we were thinking about what the idea, if it's possible to create the ideal organization, would in somehow create this kind of revolving door where throughout the year or throughout the day, you kind of take each one of these positions where you have time to think, and you have a period of, whether it's in a year or 10 years, whatever, to like a sabbatical, kind of like a thing like that, where you're able to just think deeply about the profession, the craft of teaching, the craft of
Mhm.
schooling, and
Mhm.
then you're an actual practitioner. You're actually in the field, and
Mhm.
in my head, I've heard of, forgot the book that I was reading, but a while back they were talking about how their particular school had this idea where teachers would often teach things that they didn't know themselves. And the
Mhm.
reason why is when you teach something you know well, you kind of can get to this point of exasperation that someone else doesn't understand. Like, how do you not
Mhm.
understand this? But when you
Mhm.
yourself have to learn it, you clearly understand why you wouldn't know and how to then go learn it. And so when you're teaching it,
Mhm.
you might be able to
Mhm.
like come at it with that perspective, which gives
Mhm.
space for more patience and understanding, which I think is
Mhm.
a really interesting idea where like having that ability to kind of maybe rotate through what you're teaching will constantly give
Mhm.
you new perspectives, which as a whole
Mhm.
might make you teach better. But
Mhm.
effectively, you would have to be slower, right? Because now you would have
Mhm.
to go take time to learn. So that means you can't teach as much. And so
Mhm.
when you mentioned earlier, which I thought was a great point, is when an organization is having as much strain as it does to
Mhm.
keep fulfilling, it becomes really hard to create space to slow down and
Mhm.
think.
Mhm. Mhm. A famous paper by I guess he started off as a sociologist, so I will keep him there. He talked about the paper was exploitation versus exploration, and people don't like the name of the paper anymore because the word exploit, I think, has a certain connotation. But the argument that he was making was that organizations, there's often this tension between exploring new ideas, new ways of doing things, new markets, new approaches, which in the long run might pay off more than what you're doing right now. But there's a tension between exploiting the way you've been doing things now, and by exploiting, he meant taking the best advantage of what you're doing right now and like wringing out all the good stuff from what you've got right now. And there's a tension. And then later on, a researcher's name was Mike Tushman came up with this idea, drawing on these prior ideas of it. What you need is an ambidextrous organization, an organization that can both explore and exploit at the same time. And I definitely think that's important. And I think he would also say it's much harder to actually accomplish than to recognize the importance of doing it.
Wow. I mean, this conversation in general has just been making it so, I mean, it's fat one. I think this is the first time I've had a guest on the show to really talk about how schools themselves are these like massive machines in some ways, you know, and
Sure.
while the individual classroom is kind of this place for creation and dreaming, that is really a tiny microcosm in this much, 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 much larger entity, you know, and it's just so fascinating to me because unless we address that entity, we can sometimes lose ourselves talking about something and
Mhm,
criticizing
mhm,
someone
mhm,
or one
mhm,
particular, which is just part of this much larger thing, which I think misses the point,
mhm,
which
mhm,
oftentimes seems like how a lot of our
mhm,
conversations around education end up.
mhm,
Talking about
mhm,
standards, talking about, but those are just, it's so,
mhm,
it's magnificent. So
mhm.
I guess to close off this conversation, in your kind of experience talking with different people, do you ever feel a sense of frustration or confusion in the fact that we're not addressing the kind of entire entity and we keep focusing on the wrong thing sometimes?
It's not so much frustration or confusion. It's more resignation that I try to push back against in myself. And what I mean by that is, um, it is totally reasonable and expected that people would understand most and pay attention most to the small part of the world that most impacts them and over which they have the greatest control. That is totally reasonable. But if every person is doing that, then everybody is only paying attention to their very small corner of the world. And the same thing is true from a policy perspective. And so I am a bit resigned to the fact that our natural inclination as individuals, as organizations, as a field, meaning even like a policy domain, our natural inclination is to focus on the thing that most impacts us and over which we think we have the greatest control. But that natural inclination is probably the thing that is makes it most difficult for us to move away from how we've often done things. And so I think that's what I wrestle with most. I think I'm not frustrated because it's not so much that I think people are willfully ignorant or don't want to change or don't have the capacity. I think each actor is doing what makes the most sense. And then how do you get people to challenge for themselves what makes the most sense? How do I think about things in a way that's more like the way this other person would think about things? How do I approach this problem in the way that's more like the way this other organization would approach the problem? And I think that getting out of our comfort zones, not being willing to just assume the story we've always been telling ourselves is the only story there is. I think that is especially hard. And the last thing that I'll say is while I don't find myself being frustrated, I do find myself in a lot of places where I am the one who is asking the question or pushing on, why are we doing it this way? Is there another possibility? And that comes with its own social cost because it's much more comfortable to do things the way you've always done things. It's much more efficient I mean, you can get things done without people raising a lot of questions. So I do, from a personal perspective, meaning me as an individual, find myself in a place where I am sometimes kind of not so much uncomfortable, but recognizing that I might be making other people uncomfortable in an intent to model what I
Mm,
think is important in context if we want things to be different than they always have been.
mm. I think I resonate with that feeling a lot as well. And hmm. I really want to thank you for coming on the show today. I mean, I could talk to you forever, and if in the future you have some free time, I'd love to have you on again because I think there is just so much to learn from thinking about education through this particular lens, because I think it opens up a whole new avenue of thinking about policy and implementation that purely focusing on pedagogy or focusing on the policy itself cannot do, and I think this
Mhm.
conversation is so important. So thank you again so much for coming on and sharing all your insights.
Well, I've certainly loved the experience. And if I could leave people with one final piece of imagery, it's actually based on the point that you just made, going back to those like Russian nesting dolls. If we only thought about what that tiniest doll was doing in the classroom, or we only thought about the doll on the outside, the policy, there's so much going on in between. Just putting on a different outside policy, that's not changing anything in that little tiniest nested doll. Trying to put a new tiny little doll on there while everything else is the same, that's not making any real changes. And so, really, it is being very aware of what's happening at all these different nested levels and recognizing their interconnectedness is probably the only way we're actually going to get something different.
And that makes this whole process so much more beautiful and just magnificent, and just like the fact that it even functions is crazy, like the fact that
That
you're
is
even
also true.
able to have a school that educates, millions and millions of people and get literacy rates so high. And I mean, just it's magnificent in its own unique ways too. But thank you. And I want to say to everyone listening, I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This was a really important piece, I think, to the show. And as per usual, stay re-educated.